wanted to share with you, I was asked to share with you some of the research that I have been doing with respect to a large scale study on faith and work. And so I've been working on this project for about 5 years. And I'm going to have to turn periodically, I guess, to see my slides. So I've been working on this project for about 5 years with my colleague Elaine Howard Eklund at Rice University, who is a sociologist. And in 2018, we did a national population survey of over 13,000 US adults. In 2021, we did a supplement survey because things had changed so dramatically in the workplace with respect to COVID and work from home and so on. And so we wanted to do some follow-up. So we did a supplemental survey of over 2,000 US adults. Both of these are panel surveys. So I'm a social scientist. What that means is I really like data, and you'll see a bunch of the data that I like to share. These are panel surveys, and what that means is that they're representative of the US population. So we can know with fairly high confidence that the numbers and the percentages that I'm showing are going to be representative of the whole US, not just the 13,000 or the 2,000, 15,000 plus people that we surveyed. We followed up these surveys with some in-depth interviews. And so each of these interviews was over an hour long, and we talked to folks about their experiences. We've done over 300 interviews at this point. Most of them were with workers. These are people who filled out the survey. We did also about 30 interviews with pastors. I'm not going to be talking about that pastor sample today, but we have some really interesting and rich data from them about how they think about the intersection of faith and work. So I'm going to be talking about both of these studies, and then along the way, I'm going to be pulling in some of the data with respect to entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship. But you'll see a mix of both kind of the larger study and also the entrepreneurial data that we have. So we started out, and this is kind of a good news story at the beginning. We wanted to see what kinds of connections there were between people's experiences at work and their faith communities. And this story, like I said, is largely positive for the church in particular. People's experience of meaning and purpose in work is influenced by their religious identity. So one of the things we measured was whether people identified as a religion of some kind. And then we also measured a number of other factors with respect to their religious practice, which will come out in just a second. But just in terms of who they identified as, you can see that evangelical Protestants, 85% of our respondents said that their experience of meaning and purpose in work is influenced by, well, the question we asked was, my faith or spirituality helps me experience meaning and purpose in my daily work tasks. So 85% of our evangelicals agreed with that statement. 65% of our mainlines agreed with that statement. And then you can see that it generally goes down from there for other faith identity groups. So again, a good news story. There's something that's happening in our church contexts that's influencing people positively in the workforce, and particularly with respect to their experiences of meaning and purpose at work. We also found that the level of these folks' participation in their faith communities is connected with their experience at work. And so here you see two different questions. On the top, overall, I'm very satisfied with my current job. On the bottom, I feel a strong sense of commitment to the organization I work for. And we broke these out into people who attended religious services at least once a week. That's the bottom, the orangish line. And on the top is people who say they never attend services. And so there's some really significant differences here, where folks who say that they're satisfied with their jobs, folks who say that they have a strong commitment to the organizations they work for, you are more likely to say that if you are in a context where you are attending religious services regularly. So again, something going on with that intersection of your religious experience and your experience in the workplace. Religious people also tell us that they experience benefits of their faith at work. So this is stronger for some religious identities than others, but evangelical Christians are most likely to say that they have skills and habits learned from their faith community that help them to succeed at work. And nearly 4 out of 5 evangelicals would agree with this particular statement. And again, you can see how that varies across the different groupings. So something about faith that people are recognizing influences the experiences that they're having at work, the ways that they're doing their work, and the importance of their work for them. This particular effect is significantly stronger when you compare people who attend church regularly versus those who never attend. And so you've got a huge difference. People who go to church regularly, 80% of them say that that's true. People who never go, 25% of them say that that's true. Okay, so far, this has been a sort of a good news story for churches, and now we get to maybe not so good of the news story. So far, we've been talking about meaning and purpose and satisfaction and commitment, and we found that religious identity and practice intersect with these workplace experiences. So it would seem likely that people who are religious would also say something about how their calling is influenced by their church, or that they feel a sense of calling. And in fact, that's not really what we see, although we see some patterns that are kind of interesting. So generally, evangelical Protestants have a higher sense of calling than any other religious identity, but across the board, these numbers are low. So average ratings here, about 1 in 5 people said, yes, I agree that I see my work as a spiritual calling. 1 in 5 people. So most people, 80% of people, don't agree at all. Evangelical Protestants, about 38% of them agree. So much better than average, but still less than half of evangelicals say they're experiencing the work as a calling. And then again, you can see how that goes down. Not surprisingly, people with no religion, only about 7% of them say that they have a sense of spiritual calling. Well, that makes sense because it's a spiritual calling. We really began to be curious if this experience of calling was connected in some way to the work that people do, to the level that they are in the organization, and whether or not they are entrepreneurs. And so this is where the entrepreneurial data starts to come in. In our initial sample, I said that there were 2 different surveys that we did, the 2018 survey and the 2021 survey. In our initial survey, we actually didn't ask about entrepreneurial role or status. In the 2021 survey, we did. And so what I'm going to be showing you here is a comparison between all of the data versus the 2021 data with entrepreneurs in particular. So the question we asked was, I see my work as a spiritual calling. Here, I've got 4 lines here. The one on the left is entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs agree at 36%. These are not necessarily religious people. These are just entrepreneurs. As it turns out, entrepreneurs are more likely to be religious people. But 36% of entrepreneurs say, yeah, I see my work as a calling. The next 3 lines distinguish people by level in their organization. So we asked them, in your organization, are you at the top? Are you in the middle? Are you at the bottom? So they self-identified in terms of where they are in their organization. And 26% of those at the top said, yeah, I see my work as a spiritual calling, about a quarter. 20% in the middle, of those in the middle said that they saw their work as a calling. If you're at the bottom of your organization, it is really unlikely that you view your work as a calling. Only 16% of folks in those roles have that experience. So entrepreneurs are here. Again, the takeaway is entrepreneurs are about twice as likely as the average worker to say that their work is a spiritual calling. All right, so this was all based on the survey data, but I told you that we talked to people. And so we did a bunch of interviews with folks. And in those interviews, we wanted to ask them more about this issue of calling. And so we actually pried quite a bit. And it turns out that a lot of people who said in our survey, oh, no, I don't have a sense of calling. When we talked to them, they would come around and at the end of the statement, they'd be like, oh, yeah, I guess that is a calling. It was super interesting that in the course of a conversation, they would start to recognize the ways that they had a calling. And we were not telling them, oh, you have this calling. We were asking them questions about how they experience their work, and they were coming to this conclusion, which I think is actually a really important takeaway for churches, because I think it's really important for churches to have those conversations with people to help them to start thinking through what is the meaning of my work and how is it experienced as a calling. All right. So when we interviewed people, we wanted to get at the factors that made them feel like their jobs were a calling. We found that there were 2 dimensions on which people thought about their work this way. This is the first dimension. Each dimension has two endpoints, and people can find themselves anywhere along the continuum. And actually, people can sometimes find themselves at multiple places on the continuum. This first dimension looks at whether or not people find intrinsic or extrinsic value in the work that they are doing. So intrinsic, what does that mean? That means that people who are doing that work feel like the work itself is valuable or meaningful, or it provides something that's good. So it's the work itself. Extrinsic is the work really is a means to an end. The work itself may or may not be important, but the work is doing something that is important for the people who are doing that work. So both of these are good and important. And I think sometimes, particularly in the Faith at Work movement, we tend to focus on that left end and we say intrinsic, that's really good, really important. Extrinsic, the churches have talked about this for a long time, and churches have said things like, yeah, we want your money. So extrinsically, work is good because it can help you pay us to stay in business. But in the Faith at Work movement, we've kind of dismissed that end. And I think that's a mistake. I think it's important for the Faith at Work movement to recognize that both of these aspects on this continuum are important, and important for people to start thinking through in terms of, is my work a calling? Why? Is it because it's intrinsically interesting and purposeful, meaningful? Is it because it's extrinsically purposeful and meaningful? The second dimension is it has to do with the location where the work, that the service of the work is directed. So, and the words I'm using here are proximal and distal, but really that's because I'm an academic. I should have used like close and far away. That, so proximal is close, very close to the worker. This could be things that are internal to them. In other words, they feel like their work is meaningful because it does something for or to them personally. It can also be associated with people that they work with or people who are close to them. So people that they interact with closely. Those are proximal relationships. If the location of the service is farther away, that's the distal component, there is meaning associated with what the work is doing for people out there, people in the world, people beyond the person and the people that they relate with on a regular basis. Interestingly, if you had to guess, where would you think entrepreneurs are more focused, the proximal end or the distal end? So you guys I would have thought distal. I was wrong. It's proximal. As it turns out, entrepreneurs end up focusing their sense of meaning on what is close to them. And I think this is a place where, again, the church, I think, can reach out and can help people think about their work, particularly for entrepreneurs, as who else is it serving? Are there things out there outside of you and the folks that you're talking to on a regular basis? Are there folks that the work is connecting with and impacting? All right. So I've talked about two dimensions. I'm an academic, so we like to put things into frameworks. And this framework that I'm going to show you is a 2x2, which just means these two dimensions are put together. So this is what it looks like. You can have an intrinsic versus extrinsic dimension, and you can have a proximal versus distal dimension. When you do that, you end up with 4 different quadrants. And I want to talk through each of these briefly on this slide, but I'm actually going to give you a little bit more detail on each of the quadrants and talk through some examples of people who talked to us and talked about their work as meaningful in each of these 4 quadrants. Okay. So if you start on the bottom left of this quadrant, you see the intrinsic and proximal location. This is where people who do this work feel that the work itself is a blessing from God. The work utilizes an individual's skills and talents in some way that they feel is personal, it's proximal to them, and it's really intrinsic to the work itself. The work is meaningful to them at a very personal level. If you move up to that top left quadrant, this is the intrinsic and distal. This is where the goods and services that the work creates are seen as serving the common good. So this is the work serves the common good, the goods and services produced serve others in some way. If you move to the bottom right quadrant, this is the extrinsic and proximal quadrant. This is where the workplace serves others at work. So the work itself the workplace provides opportunities for workers to help others, whether those are colleagues or customers or something like that. And then in the top right, you have extrinsic and distal. And this is where I think much of the conversation historically has been in the church. And I think there's been pushback from the Faith at Work movement against this quadrant. But this is where the work serves others beyond the work. The work itself is not important per se, but what the work can provide to others is important. So the work provides resources that people can use to serve those outside of the workplace, whether that's families, could be churches, it could be communities, and so on. So let's look at each of these quadrants a little bit more in turn. The first one is the intrinsic and proximal, where work is viewed as a blessing from God. So the meaning of work here is intrinsic due to the nature of the work itself, and the serving orientation is internal to the workplace. So the work allows the worker's skills to be put to good use. The primary benefit is to the individual worker, and they experience the work either as a blessing from God or the sense that God directed me here. I was made for this work. Those are the kinds of statements that we heard from people that kind of reflected this orientation. Now, let me say something real quick. Can I go back? Haha, I can. I've showed this sort of sense of meaning or ways of thinking about calling in terms of 4 quadrants. Many people would locate themselves in one of these quadrants, but some people located themselves in multiple quadrants. These are not mutually exclusive quadrants. And I think the goal for the church is to help people expand their sense of calling. And so if somebody is stuck in one quadrant, help them to think about, are there other ways to experience work as calling? So there's nothing bad about any of these quadrants, but all of them in some sense are a little deficient. Okay, so each of them has something that it's missing. So the first quadrant, we're talking about work as a blessing from God. God directed me here. I was made for this work. What we find is that this is the one quadrant that entrepreneurs are most likely to say that they fall into. They say things like, God guided me to my work. And we saw this in our survey data as well. I should back up for a second. I talked about, we did over 300 interviews. Almost none of those interviews were with entrepreneurs. And the reason for that is because entrepreneurs are actually a fairly small percentage of our sample. And we were trying to access other dimensions, and we weren't focusing our conversations about entrepreneurship per se. So most of my data on entrepreneurs actually comes from the surveys that we did, or the second survey in particular. And so we did have survey questions that tapped into this notion of work as a blessing from God. And this is where our entrepreneurs rated things significantly higher than non-entrepreneurs. So they were much more likely than non-entrepreneurs to say things like, God directed me to my work in the survey. I have a quote here from a person that I think is a good representation of this orientation. This is an evangelical woman who is a corporate trainer. And she said, for many decades, I believe that one of my purposes on the earth is just to help people. God's given me a gift to teach and to train. And so obviously this is the job, corporate trainer, where the job title itself is trainer. Being at this job allows me to do what I do well, which is to train and educate. So it's very proximate, or very close to her. It's about her skills, her talents. There's a sense that God has blessed her in giving her this work. There's a sense that God has directed her to this work. All right. Second quadrant is this notion of work serving the common good. This is the intrinsic and distal orientation. This is the idea that what I make or what I do helps people. It benefits society in some way. It contributes to the common good. We had a guy who worked at Subway who told us this. He was a manager at Subway. He goes, the fact that it's Subway, it's vegetables and food and stuff that people can conceivably be nourished by, and it's located in some of the toughest regions in the world. They feed a lot of people every day. I definitely did consider that, and definitely considered, does that line up? Does that track with what I'm called upon to do by the Gospels? So he absolutely is thinking about his work at Subway as serving the common good, and a really positive way of thinking about his work here. Now, interestingly, there was absolutely no difference between entrepreneurs and non-entrepreneurs on this particular dimension. So entrepreneurs don't think of their work any differently than non-entrepreneurs as far as serving the common good. And generally speaking, these, so I guess that the takeaway is that both entrepreneurs and non-entrepreneurs could be stretched a little in this dimension, could focus a little bit more on how their work serves the common good. All right, third dimension, serving others at work. This is the extrinsic proximal quadrant. We heard people say things like, I'm able to help the people I interact with at work, or I share my faith at work. So these are ways that people found their work meaningful. It really didn't have to do with the work itself. It could be any job. Any job would allow them to do this. Any kind of work would allow them to do this. But the workplace was the location that allowed them to do it. And so it was close to them, but it was extrinsic to the work itself. And what we found is that entrepreneurs were a lot higher than non-entrepreneurs on this particular area. And maybe that makes sense because entrepreneurs control their workplace in some ways. They control what happens, they control what gets to be talked about. And they felt like their jobs, their tasks that they were creating allowed them to serve others in that workspace. So they were able to serve their employees, they were able to serve their customers as people. Not necessarily because of the work that they were doing, but because of the relationships that they had with those people. And they were also talked a little bit about how the importance of sharing faith at work. They in particular talked in the survey, rated questions about caring for people, caring for the well-being of people at work much higher than people who were non-entrepreneurs. Here's an example of this particular perspective. People at the packing house. So this is a white evangelical Christian man who's the director of field operations in a fruit packing plant. He says, people at the packing house, they have a nickname for me. They call me Yoda. And it's like they come to me if they have a problem. And even the people who don't believe in God do that. And so I've met with this one guy for, I don't know, it's been about 4 weeks trying to help him get reconciled with his wife. So he views his job as really important, really something God has called him to, not because he's packing fruit, but because he's able to work with people in the packing plant and engage with them as people and nourish relationships with them. All right, last quadrant, serving others beyond work. And this is where we had people say things like, my job provides resources that I can use to support my family, to support my church. I had one woman who said, my job allows me to feed my family. Isn't that a calling from God? Of course it is. And she was actually a housekeeper. So she worked at a hotel, she was cleaning rooms, and she didn't view that. She wasn't thinking about the work itself. She was thinking about this job allows her to keep shoes on her children and feed her family. Again, no difference here between entrepreneurs and non-entrepreneurs. So they think about this kind of roughly the same. But here's an example of somebody who talks about this. And this is an interesting one. I'll come back to this in a second. This is an evangelical Christian who's an engineer. I happen to be married to a white man who's an evangelical Christian engineer. So I know that he could probably resonate with this. And this guy says it provides, he's talking about his job. Well, it provides a means. We tithe. And so anything I do at work in turn helps my church or any other organizations we wish to give to. So I guess indirectly, that's somewhat of a calling. Man, I never thought of that before. So on the survey, this guy's like, no, my job's not a spiritual calling. But when we talked to him, he's like, oh yeah, actually, it's really important what I do. And there was a sense of kind of excitement in his voice as he's telling us about this work that he is doing. All right, so let me talk about some research takeaways. First, faith helps people experience purpose and meaning at work. We saw this regularly. The more engaged people are in their church communities, the more they are likely to view their work as helping them view their faith communities as helping them succeed at work. However, most people don't think of their work as calling. And so this is an area of growth, I think, for seminaries and for churches. People experience calling in different ways. And so there's not a one size is the right way. There are many ways. And I think we need to be more open to the idea of multiple ways of thinking about calling. Churches can help people expand their ideas of calling. And entrepreneurs in particular should be encouraged to focus on ways that their work impacts others. It's that distally focused kind of work because they're no different than non-entrepreneurs when it comes to that. Whereas in the proximal location, they're much higher than most employees when it comes to thinking about the ways that their work is a calling.